What's up, folks? So we are back to cover this episode 6 of Dark Side of the Ring, brought to you by Vice TV. And this episode is the assassination of Dino Bravo.
Dino Bravo was an icon in Quebec.
He loved to live dangerously.
He thought nothing could touch him. His world was the wrestling world. It wasn't the organized crime world. He screwed up.
You hear all kind of different stories, about what happened.
It was so sketchy on everything. He got 11 bullets in the body and 7 bullets in the head. Let that be a lesson. Everybody's touchable.
Instantly, this episode comes off much different than the other ones for me. One, because, I didn't know much about Dino. I had seen him about his time shortly in WWF, respectively, at the time. And this episode, I felt like just didn't have a lot of depth like the other ones did. I mean, quite frankly, I felt like around the 35-minute mark of the episode, there wasn't much more that was really, provided to the viewers that made that extra time, much more different than the information that had been piled on beforehand. So I felt like this episode didn't provide a lot of depth, and it could have just been, frankly, because I just did not know much about this story, period. And I didn't know much about him as the wrestler, him as the person, and so as much I was interested, no doubt, but maybe it just didn't it didn't captivate me like many of the other episodes did. But nonetheless, it was good. It still had a lot of good information, and it was still bizarre as hell because, like, again, it's another episode of a wrestler that you just like, wow, like outside of the ring, you just didn't have any clue, you know what I mean? Or not just because I didn't know him, it's not like the regular, like, I didn't know he could be involved in that. It's like I didn't have any clue like wrestlers would have this type of fate outside of wrestling. I mean, a wrestler, especially in the 80s and 90s, are bigger, larger than life superstars. And with him being in Canada, he was part of the international wrestling promotion, which he was part of. Then he eventually started running, and he was just the biggest star in all of Canada, in Montreal specifically. And he was so big, it even took the likes of Vince McMahon and the recruitment of saying, hey, we need this guy, because he was really just that big of a star. But it's just kind of like, you just put all that together. It's like, wow, I really had no clue, somebody's fate after wrestling could ultimately have a demise such as this. But Dino was killed in 1993, and he was shot 11 times in the body and 7 times in the head in the seat of his home. Wow. I mean, being killed is enough, but the style of execution that was done here is just is unprecedented. And we'll talk about it in a second, but it's just mind blowing. But the first thing for me about this show, going into the informational aspect, is that his daughters. First of all, his daughter Claudia is just, hearing her and really recount all the emotion from her as a child to this point it's just heartfelt, and she's so strong. And again, this is another episode where the women just proved to be and show how strong they are, because with her and her mother really having to go back down memory lane and really talk about each one of these pivotal steps in his career and how it affected their life. And the fact that they're still able to stay proud and positive about this is just strong, because it's just filled with emotion the entire time, and it touches you. And it's just seeing them looking at photo albums and just remembering like the funeral and stuff like that, it's just a lot. It really is. But look, let me put Dino into perspective really quick here. Dino to Canada is what Hulk Hogan was to America in the 80s and 90s. She was just that big of a star. And ultimately, that was what Vince saw, and that's what Vince knew he needed, and he wanted to recruit him. And ultimately, before he was even able to recruit him to join WWF, there was the idea of having the two of the, Hulk and him work together for a match, but they weren't able to do it because they feared, Hulk would not be the biggest draw in Montreal. Dino was just that big, so they ultimately didn't do the match, and that really rubbed Dino the wrong way. It made WWF not only just a competitor but the enemy, and he was really spiteful about that. So, we'll talk about that in a second. But it's when you think about WWE and WWF and their longevity and just the juggernaut they are. Wanting to be at foes with them is never a good thing, and it proved again that Vince is the tyrant that he is, and just no one's ever going to stand up to him, especially back then. But nonetheless, when you go toe to toe with Vince, it's again, it's not a good thing. So ultimately, Dino, ego driven, said he was going to make international wrestling the biggest wrestling promotion, and he was going to compete with WWF. And sooner or later, Vince started recruiting everybody on his roster to the point that Dino was left to making a decision of seeing his business crumble, and ultimately happened to join WWE himself. And doing so, Vince truly tested him there, because obviously he remembered the rivalry, and when he brought him in, he really tested his ego and his character. He gave him a different look, an untraditional Canadian look. And even his other Canadian friends laughed at him, because it's like, there's no way anybody from Canada would ever look like this. So it was an interesting time, and not only just that too, just that stardom and that glow and that glare that he had in Canada, it just got lost in the mix with WWF, because it didn't resonate with the American crowds as much as he thought it would, and plus he was just in a pack. It was just a number, a statistic there, because there was so many other competitors there that that just got him lost in the bunch, and it was just truly hard for him to stand out. But ultimately he was then released, and his contract wasn't renewed with WWF, so he left, and he had to go back home, and he had to go back to what he knew. And the crazy thing about that is he only knew wrestling, so there was no other experience in any other workforce or job that he could go back to. But back in Canada, back in Montreal, he had connections, and his connections was to the streets. And when he went back to the streets, it's exactly what I'm saying it is. He went to the streets. So he went to going and dealing with, because back in this day, in the streets, the mafia and the gangs were at an all-time high. I mean, for me, and I had no clue about this being in Canada, I'm just going to draw a parallel here to New York. It is as banging as it was in New York and Canada, and they put a lot of emphasis saying that in Montreal was truly one of the most dangerous places in all the world at the time. So it was just that, and he went back there because he had ties to that. And when he went back to it, he was like an enforcer, because he was this big muscular guy, and when people had to go pay other people, he was sent to make people pay up. He was the collector. He was the muscle for people, and people trusted him because they know he would strike fear into others, and he was the perfect person to make sure that people promised their deaths. And it was a very dangerous job, because it really involved new friends and just new people, and the family and everybody took notice, because like, who in the world are all these people that he's just being affiliated with? But even all the way into the night that he was murdered, it was just a really eerie night, because he made a lot of he extended reach out to a lot of his friends that he hadn't even really talked to in a long time. So it was just really recounting that whole night of him extending his reach and trying to communicate with the other people before he knew it was going to happen. Obviously, it would have seemed like ultimately it's just a really eerie feel. But not only was he just involved in the games as far as being a muscle, he actually started diving more deeper into it, and he got into what was absolutely the most booming business within the streets at the time, and that was the cigarette smuggling business. And it was just because it was so popular. When you think about drugs and stuff like that, you always want to think about marijuana, cocaine, whatever it may be. But because the cigarette business was so booming, you even had people that was affiliated with those other drugs really taking an eye to this, like, hey, how can we get involved? Because it was just in that just demand. I mean, you have to imagine, as much as popular cigarettes was then, being able to obtain them illegally and distribute them legally. I mean, it just seems, it seems to command the attention that you would think it would. But nonetheless, Dino gotten involved with that, and then apparently a deal went bad, which cost the gang some money, and then he was trying to do business on his own behind the backs of them, and it was just a lot that was going on, and it all caught up, what ultimately led to his demise. And even 30 years later, it's still unsolved. It's an open case. So a lot of the people that this documentary wanted to get testimonies with couldn't, because the case is still active. But just from the people that was involved with this right now, there was just enough information to kind of lead your mind one way or another, like, well, I wonder what it could be, what ultimately could have happened. But Dino is popular as a wrestler as he was in the ring. He was just one of those guys. He was just a gang member ultimately outside of the ring, and he was just doing whatever he could to try to support his family, because after not being able to bring in that type of money he was within the ring, he had to make ends meet, and this was his way. It was not smart. It was very dangerous, and ultimately led to the demise of his life. But this is what he knew. This is the only resource he had, and he turned to it. So that's just the premise mostly of what this was. But ultimately, last little thing I'll say, they showed a lot of really old pictures of Dino with other wrestlers and stuff, with the Giant, Hogan, and just other wrestlers. It's just, I love the photography that they using. Those pictures, just looking at those old school pictures, were so epic. Jimmy Hart, who was his manager at the time in WWF, Jimmy Hart just proves again why he's just one of the best of all time. And as a manager, he's really, truly worked with everybody, and he's truly helped elevate everybody's career. It's just a phenomenal person that just deserves all the credit in the world. And other than that, I can't wait to see what happens next week with next episode they're going to have, how the dynamic and the tone's going to change. But for this one, for me, again, it just was very informative. It had a lot of information, and I'm sure it's going to pay dividends, because it's still an open case, so it brought this case back to the national attention, and maybe there can be more information that comes out that could really give this family some peace. But Dino is the wrestler. As big as a star as he was, like I said, the Canadian Hulk Hogan, if you want to ask, as far as draw and star power, when he left the WWF, he just turned into a dangerous life, and it, as it need all that type of living. It eventually catches up, and it caught up to him in 1993, suffering a massive assassination in the living room of his house. But I hope you like this review, and we'll be back next week for episode 7 of Dark Side of the Ring.